The rich boss gave the orphan boy a dry well to get rid of him. "Listen here, you little runt. Your father was a fool who got himself killed walking into that rotten mine shaft, and your mother was so weak she died of a broken heart. And now you, a skinny 12-year-old with 2 bawling brats, you come demanding money from me? Take this dry well that's been dead for 40 years and get out. If I see your face again, I'll call CPS to have your siblings split up, the girl to a foster home in the next county, the baby to another, and you to reform school." Billy Ray Miller, just 12 years old, felt each word like a physical blow. His father, Thomas, had died 3 weeks ago in a mine collapse, and his mother, Grace, followed just 8 days later. Now, Billy Ray was the sole protector of 8-year-old Rosie and 3-year-old Willie, who trembled against his patched pants as the foreman sneered, adding to the cruelty. Mr. Thornton threw the deed onto his desk. Billy Ray picked it up in silence, lifted his little brother, took his sister's hand and walked out without crying. He couldn't. If he cried, they would cry, and someone had to be strong. Before we continue Billy Ray's heart-wrenching journey, we want to be transparent with you. This story was crafted with the help of artificial intelligence to build the structure, but a human writer infused it with the emotion and detail needed to tell a powerful story for a real audience just like you. We believe these tales carry important messages. To help us share them, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from, subscribe to our channel, and give this video a like. Your support means the world to us. It allows us to continue telling stories like this one, which sadly reflect the reality for countless children who lose their parents. For them, the fight to keep their brothers and sisters together is not a story. It's a daily battle for survival, against a world that can be incredibly cruel. As Billy Ray led his younger siblings away from the foreman's office, the weight of the deed in his hand felt insignificant compared to the crushing weight of his memories. Just a month ago, his father, Thomas Miller, had been the center of their world. For 22 years, Thomas had descended into the dark shafts of Thornton Creek mining, his body aging prematurely under the strain, his hands permanently stained with coal dust. He sacrificed his youth and his health for the vague promises Mr. Thornton would make about a future bonus or a small plot of company land. Thomas wasn't just a miner, he was a teacher. He taught Billy Ray that a man's worth wasn't in his wallet, but in his word, and that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you. He dreamed of a day when his son wouldn't have to follow him into the mines, a day they would own something that was truly theirs. That dream was now buried under tons of rock in the East Ridge. The heart of their small home had been his mother, Grace. While Thomas was the family's rock, Grace was the gentle stream that flowed around it, giving life to everything she touched. She could make a feast out of potatoes and beans, and her lullabies could soothe the deepest fears. Her hands, though worn from scrubbing and mending, were always soft when they wiped away a tear. When Thomas died, something inside Grace simply broke. The doctor called it a fever, but everyone in the hollow knew it was a broken heart. She faded in just 8 days, her last whispers being the names of her husband and children. For Billy Ray, losing his mother so soon after his father was like having the sun and moon extinguished in the same week. It was the loss of his last refuge, the final closing of the door to his childhood, leaving him alone in the cold, dark night with 2 smaller shadows to protect. Before the collapse, Billy Ray was just a boy. He spent his days shadowing his father, his small hands trying to mimic the confident way Thomas handled a pickaxe or read the seams of coal in a rock face. He learned the smell of damp earth, the sound of a stable tunnel versus a dangerous one, and the quiet language of men who work underground. His father's approval was his greatest treasure, earned with a well-tied knot or a correctly identified mineral. Billy Ray absorbed every lesson, not knowing he was being trained for survival. In those moments, he was not a future orphan, but a beloved son and apprentice. He remembered the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture that said, "You're a good boy, son, you'll be a good man." It was a promise he now had to keep, a promise solidified in the cold silence of 2 fresh graves on the hillside. His siblings were his world now, the living pieces of the family he had to hold together. Rosie, at 8, was old enough to understand loss but too young to process it. She was the quiet observer, her large, dark eyes mirroring their mother's. She would often ask in a small voice, "Do you think Papa and Mama are together now?" A question that twisted a knife in Billy Ray's heart. Then there was Willie, only 3, a bundle of pure innocence, who only understood that his world had been turned upside down. He would cry for his mother in the night and cling to Billy Ray's leg during the day, his tiny hand a constant, desperate anchor. Billy Ray remembered evenings when their small cabin was filled with laughter, his father tossing a giggling Willie into the air while Rosie showed off a drawing to their smiling mother. That warmth seemed a lifetime away now. Their dreams had been as simple and humble as their meals. Around the dinner table, Thomas would speak of a future away from the soot and danger of the mines. He described a small plot of land, maybe with a creek running through it, where they could build a real house, not a company shack. "A man's got to have something that's his own," he'd say, looking at Billy Ray. "Something to pass down that isn't just debt and a bad cough." Grace would add to the dream, planning a vegetable garden and a sturdy rope swing on an old oak tree for the children. This shared vision wasn't about getting rich. It was about dignity, safety, and the freedom to breathe air that wasn't owned by Mr. Thornton. It was the promise of this future that had kept Thomas going into that mine every single day for 22 years, a future now stolen from them. The cruelty Billy Ray faced in Mr. Thornton's office was not a surprise, merely a confirmation of what his father had always known. Thomas often spoke in hushed tones about the boss's disregard for safety, how new timber supports were always deemed too expensive, and how men who complained were quietly let go. The entire town of Thornton Creek was a web of fear spun by one man's greed. Mr. Thornton owned the mine, the company store where they were forced to shop, and the shacks they lived in. He owned their lives. Whispers circulated about other families left destitute after mining accidents, promises of compensation dissolving into thin air once the funeral was over. Thomas's death was not a random tragedy. It was an inevitability created by a system that valued coal more than the men who dug it. Mr. Thornton hadn't just insulted an orphan, he had revealed the rotten core of his empire. The news of his father's death came not as a gentle whisper, but as a piercing shriek from the mine's emergency siren, a sound that froze the blood of every family in Thornton Creek. Billy Ray had run with his mother to the gates, joining the silent, terrified vigil of women and children. Hours later, the foreman emerged, his face covered in soot and grim resignation, and confirmed the collapse in the East Ridge. Everyone knew that section was a death trap, supported by rotting timbers Mr. Thornton refused to replace. At the funeral, a simple affair by a muddy graveside, the boss himself had placed a heavy hand on Billy Ray's shoulder, his voice thick with false sympathy. "Thomas was a good man," he'd said, loud enough for all to hear. "Don't you worry, son. I'll make sure his family is taken care of." It was a hollow promise, spoken over the very ground that held the man his greed had killed. Grace Miller simply could not survive without the other half of her soul. In the 8 days that followed Thomas's burial, she withered like a flower cut from its roots. The doctor's diagnosis of a severe fever was just a clinical name for a shattered heart. Billy Ray watched helpless as the light in his mother's eyes dimmed, her body surrendering to a grief too profound to bear. Rosie would sit by the bed asking in a hushed tone, "Is Mama going to heaven to be with Papa?" Billy Ray had no answers, only a growing knot of terror in his stomach. He tried to coax his mother to eat, bringing her broth he barely knew how to make, but she would only shake her head, her last whispers calling out for Thomas. When she finally passed in the quiet of dawn, the silence in the small shack was absolute, a crushing void where a family used to be. The 3 weeks after his father's death felt like a lifetime of hunger and fear. The small amount of money Thomas had saved was gone, spent on funeral costs and a few bags of flour and beans. Their credit at the company store was abruptly cut off. Meals became a desperate calculation of survival. A single potato boiled and split 3 ways, a thin soup made from water and cornmeal. Billy Ray always took the smallest portion, lying to Rosie that he'd already eaten, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, a constant reminder of his failure. It was the sound of Willie crying in the night, his small voice pleading for more food, that finally broke through Billy Ray's fear. He remembered Mr. Thornton's promise. Clutching that memory like a last hope, he put on his cleanest patched shirt, took his siblings by the hand, and walked toward the mine owner's office to claim what his father had earned. Mr. Thornton's office was a world away from the coal-dusted shacks of the miners. It was a fortress of wealth, built on the broken backs of men like Thomas Miller. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and polished leather, a stark contrast to the smell of poverty and grief the children carried with them. Billy Ray stood before the massive oak desk, a small, defiant figure flanked by his two even smaller siblings. Mr. Thornton sat like a king on a throne, his large frame filling a leather chair, his foreman standing beside him like a loyal guard dog. The mine owner let them stand in silence for a long moment, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he sized them up. "Well?" he finally boomed, his voice dripping with impatience and disdain. "What does the orphan want?" Billy Ray swallowed his fear, his voice barely a whisper, but steady. "I came for my father's pay, sir, for his 22 years. The mine owner let out a short, barking laugh that echoed in the large room. He leaned forward, his face turning a blotchy red as he unleashed the torrent of cruelty he had waiting for the boy. He repeated the words from the initial confrontation, each syllable a calculated strike. "Listen here, you little runt. Your father was a fool who got himself killed walking into that rotten mine shaft, and your mother was so weak she died of a broken heart." He paused, savoring the fear in the children's eyes. "And now you, a skinny 12-year-old with two bawling brats, you come demanding money from me?" He then snatched a folded paper from a drawer. "Take this dry well that's been dead for 40 years and get out. If I see your face again, I'll call CPS to have your siblings split up. The girl to a foster home in the next county, the baby to another, and you to reform school." He threw the deed onto the desk, the paper landing like a final, definitive insult. Billy Ray stared at the deed, his entire body trembling with a rage he couldn't show. He saw Rosie flinch at the threat, her small hand tightening its grip on his pants. Willie began to cry, burying his face in his brother's leg. The foreman sneered, adding his own venom. "Raise your siblings? They'll be in the system in a week, each one sent a different way." But Billy Ray didn't speak. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of his tears or his anger. With a dignity that seemed impossible for a boy his age, he reached out and took the worthless deed. He then bent down, lifted a sobbing Willie into his arms, took Rosie's hand, and turned his back on the two men. He walked out of that opulent office and into the harsh sunlight, each step a silent promise to the memory of his parents. He would not let them be separated. He would not let this injustice be the end of their story. He would survive. The parcel of land Mr. Thornton had given them was an insult made real. It was a barren, forgotten corner of the county, where nothing grew but thistle and bitterweed. At its center stood the dry well, a ring of crumbling stones choked with debris, a gaping mouth in the cracked earth that seemed to mock their thirst. A dilapidated shack, leaning so far to one side it looked like a strong wind could finish it, was their only shelter. The air smelled of dust, decay, and utter hopelessness. Billy Ray stood looking at it, the deed a worthless piece of paper in his hand, feeling the full weight of the foreman's cruel laughter. Rosie, her small hand clutching his shirt, whispered, "Billy Ray, this place is scary." Willie, too young to understand despair but old enough to sense it, pointed a tiny finger at the shack. "Is this where we live now?" he asked, his innocent question more painful than any insult. Billy Ray swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a strength he did not feel. "It's an adventure," he told them, his voice rough. "We're going to fix it up, make it our own castle." He led them inside the one-room shack. The roof had more holes than shingles, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls. That night they huddled together for warmth on a pile of old burlap sacks, covering themselves with a single threadbare blanket. In the suffocating darkness, Rosie's quiet voice broke the silence. "Why was that man so mean to you? Is Papa really not coming back?" Billy Ray held his siblings tighter, murmuring reassurances he didn't believe himself. He was their shield, their parent, their only source of warmth, and he couldn't let them see the cracks that were forming deep inside him as the cold seeped up from the dirt floor. Their new life was a daily battle against starvation. The dry well was a constant, mocking reminder of their thirst, forcing Billy Ray to make a 4-mile round trip to the creek each morning, carrying Willie on his back and a heavy, rusted bucket. He taught Rosie how to spot the few edible berries and roots his father had shown him, but they were never enough. Their meals were meager and heartbreaking. A single egg, gifted by a neighbor who looked away in shame, was carefully fried and split 3 ways. A handful of cornmeal was stirred into boiling water to make a thin, tasteless gruel. Billy Ray always took the smallest portion, or none at all, pushing his share toward Rosie. "I ate while I was out," he'd lie, the acid of hunger burning in his stomach. He was slowly starving himself to keep them alive. The community of Thornton Creek treated them like ghosts, specters of a tragedy they preferred to ignore. Mr. Thornton's men would sometimes drive by the property, slowing down to laugh at the sight of a boy trying to patch a roof with scrap tin. "Look at him playing farmer," one yelled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "I give him a month before he's begging." Even those who felt pity offered it in the cruelest way. An older woman from the church stopped him on the road, her voice dripping with sanctimonious concern. "Son, you're a good boy. But you can't raise these children," she said gently. "It's best you turn them over to the state. It would be a mercy." Each word was a confirmation of his deepest fear, that the world saw them not as a family, but as a problem to be solved by separating them. That fear became a terrifying reality one sweltering afternoon when a county official's car rumbled down their path. A stern-faced woman with a clipboard announced she was from Child Protective Services, acting on an anonymous complaint. A complaint Billy Ray knew came directly from Mr. Thornton. He stood in the doorway of the shack, a small but defiant guard, hiding Rosie and Willie behind him. He answered her questions with a calm, steady voice that belied the frantic pounding of his heart, explaining his plans to fix the roof and plant a garden. "We're a family," he repeated, the words his only weapon. "We belong together." The woman looked at his calloused hands and the fierce, protective look in his eyes. She left with a heavy warning. She would return in 1 month, and if their living conditions had not dramatically improved, she would be forced to place all 3 of them in foster care. That night was the absolute lowest point of Billy Ray's life. A summer storm raged outside, and inside the shack, Willie burned with fever, his weak cries cutting through the sound of the rain. They had no medicine, and Rosie had cried herself to sleep, her stomach aching with hunger. Once they were both finally quiet, Billy Ray stumbled outside and fell to his knees beside the dry well, letting the cold rain mix with the hot, silent tears he could no longer hold back. He was failing them. He looked up at the black, unforgiving sky and spoke to the only person he could. "Dad," he choked out, his voice raw with grief. "I promised you. I promised I'd keep them safe. But I can't. Willie's sick and they're starving. Maybe that woman was right." In that moment, broken and alone, he was ready to surrender. Just as the last of his resolve crumbled, the shack door creaked open. Rosie stood there, a small, shivering silhouette against the darkness. She walked over to him, oblivious to the rain, and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. "I had a dream, Billy Ray," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Mama was here. She was standing right by this well and she was smiling. She told me to tell you something. She said, 'You tell your brother he can't let you go. Not ever.'" The simple, powerful message delivered through the innocence of his sister struck Billy Ray like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just a dream. It was an order. It was hope. He pulled Rosie into a fierce hug, his own strength returning as he absorbed hers. He would not break his promise. He would not be defeated. The storm passed, and the next morning dawned clear and bright. A change had settled over Billy Ray. The despair hadn't vanished, but it had been forged by the night's trial into something harder: determination. Willie's fever had broken, and Rosie's dream had given him a purpose beyond mere survival. He looked at the barren land, the dilapidated shack, and the dry well not as symbols of his failure, but as his battlefield. This was his ground to defend. He remembered his father, Thomas, teaching him how to work a seam of coal. "Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden the deepest," his father had said. "You just have to be willing to dig where no one else will." Billy Ray found an old rusted pickaxe leaning against the shack. He walked to the well, took a firm stance, and swung. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was finally digging. The days that followed were a testament to a will forged in grief and love. Billy Ray attacked the dry well with a fury that defied his 12 years and skinny frame. Every morning before the sun crested the Appalachian hills, he was there, his father's rusted pickaxe feeling both foreign and familiar in his hands. He worked methodically, first clearing the tangled weeds and debris that choked the well's opening, then descending into the darkness to haul out buckets of dry, compacted earth and loose stones. His hands, already calloused from a childhood of chores, soon blistered, bled, and then hardened into something new. He ignored the pain, the burning in his shoulders, and the exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. He was no longer just a boy. He was a miner, just like his father, digging not for coal, but for a miracle, fueled by the memory of a promise and the terror of separation. He was not entirely alone in his monumental task. Rosie, with a quiet solemnity that mirrored her brother's, became his steadfast partner. She would make the long trek to the creek for water, not just for them to drink, but to bring to Billy Ray, who would pour it over his head to fight off the dizzying heat. While he worked, she would sit nearby with Willie, telling him stories or drawing pictures in the dirt, keeping him safe and out of the way. Willie, in his 3-year-old innocence, saw it all as a grand game. He would cheer whenever Billy Ray hoisted a particularly large rock from the well. "You're strong like Papa," he'd shout, his small voice echoing in the quiet clearing. Each word was a fresh log on the fire of Billy Ray's determination, a reminder that his exhaustion was a small price to pay for their survival as a family. The world outside their small, desperate bubble remained as cruel as ever. Mr. Thornton's men would occasionally drive by on the main road, slowing their trucks to gawk and jeer. "Hey, runt! Find any gold down there yet?" one would yell, followed by a chorus of laughter. "That boy's crazier than his old man, digging in a dead well." The foreman once stopped his truck, leaned out the window with a cruel smirk, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "CPS is going to love this," he sneered. "Making your siblings live next to a giant hole. You're making it easy for 'em, kid." Billy Ray never looked up. He never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply swung the pickaxe again, each impact a silent, defiant answer, his focus locked on the earth beneath his feet, the only thing he felt he could control. As the days bled into weeks and the hole grew deeper, Billy Ray began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. Down in the cooler depths of the well, certain layers of rock he chipped away had a strange bluish-green hue, unlike the familiar grey slate and brown dirt of the region. When he'd strike these rocks with the pickaxe, they'd sometimes flake away to reveal a faint, almost greasy shimmer in the lantern light. He paid it little mind, assuming it was just some strange mineral deposit, fool's gold maybe. There was also a peculiar, sweet, almost earthy scent that clung to the air at the bottom, a smell entirely different from the musty odor of decay he expected. He was too consumed by the sheer physical effort and the looming deadline from the social worker to give these oddities any real thought. He was just digging. There were nights when his resolve nearly shattered. With the children asleep inside the shack, he would sit by the edge of the well, his body a single throbbing ache, and stare into the blackness he had carved. The CPS woman's face would flash in his mind, her warning about foster care echoing in the silence. Doubt, cold and sharp, would pierce his defenses. What if this was all for nothing? What if he was just a foolish boy wasting his last precious days on a fantasy? He'd look up at the star-filled Kentucky sky and speak to his father in a broken whisper. "Am I doing the right thing, Dad? I'm so tired. I don't know how much longer I can go on." In those moments, he would force himself to remember Thomas's steady voice. "Dignity, son. It's the one thing you build yourself and no one can ever take away." The morning of the social worker's scheduled return arrived with a heavy, humid stillness. Billy Ray knew this was his last chance. He had been digging for nearly a month, and the well was now a deep, cylindrical shaft, a testament to his impossible effort. He descended one last time, his muscles screaming, his hands feeling like raw, open wounds. He told himself he would clear just one more foot of earth, and then he would face whatever came. He was numb with exhaustion, running on nothing but the fumes of a desperate promise. He lifted the heavy pickaxe over his head, channeling every ounce of his remaining strength, every bit of his fear and his love, into one final powerful swing. Instead of the familiar, dull thud of steel hitting packed earth, The tool struck something hard with a sharp metallic clang that vibrated up his arms and echoed strangely in the confined space. The clang reverberated through his bones, a sound so alien in the soft earth he'd been fighting for weeks. Billy Ray froze, his arms aching, his breath held tight in his chest. It wasn't the dead thud of dirt or the crack of common stone. This was different, metallic, solid. He knelt, his lantern casting flickering shadows, and began to scrape away the loose dirt with his bare hands. The bluish-green streaks he had ignored before were everywhere here, concentrated around a thick, dark vein of rock that seemed to absorb the light. He chipped at it gently with the tip of the pickaxe, and a section flaked off, revealing a surface with a strange, greasy luster. It wasn't gold or silver. It was something else, something ancient and dense. The sweet, earthy smell he'd noticed was strongest here, emanating from the dark stone itself. A tremor of cautious excitement, the first he'd felt in months, ran through him. With trembling hands, he managed to pry a small, fist-sized chunk of the dark mineral loose. It was surprisingly heavy, its density feeling important in his palm. He climbed out of the well, blinking in the bright morning sun, and held it up. Rosie and Willie, drawn by the halt in his work, came closer. "What is it?" Rosie asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. She reached out a small finger and traced its shimmering surface. "It's pretty, Billy Ray. It shines like a rainbow when you turn it." As she spoke, a memory sparked in his mind, a story his father had told him late one night about the deep secrets of the mountains. He'd spoken of black diamond, a rare industrial carbonado, incredibly tough and more valuable than the gems in a jeweler's window. Most miners overlooked it, mistaking it for worthless coal. Could it be? The idea seemed too fantastical, a desperate dream born of exhaustion. The impossible thought, the sheer, staggering possibility of it, shattered the wall he had built around his heart. He looked down at the heavy, dark stone in his hand, then at the innocent, questioning faces of his siblings. He thought of his father's 22 years of back-breaking labor for nothing, his mother's fatal grief, and the cruel, laughing face of Mr. Thornton as he'd handed over this worthless land. The cosmic injustice and the sudden, blinding hope were too much to bear. A strange, choked laugh escaped his lips, which quickly twisted into a raw, heart-wrenching sob. For the first time since he'd become their sole protector, Billy Ray cried. He wept openly, the tears of a grieving, terrified, and hopeful 12-year-old boy. Rosie and Willie rushed to him, wrapping their small arms around his shaking frame. He hugged them tight, looked to the sky, and whispered, "You knew, didn't you, Dad? You brought us here." After the storm of emotion passed, a cold, sharp clarity settled over him. This rock was not a victory yet. It was a secret, a fragile and dangerous one. He knew Mr. Thornton's greed. If the boss discovered the true nature of this land, he would invent a lie, claim the deed was a clerical error, and use his army of lawyers and thugs to take it all back, leaving them with nothing once more. He knelt and pulled Rosie close, his voice low and urgent. "Rosie, listen to me. We can't tell anyone about this. Not a single soul. This is our secret. It could be how we stay together forever, but only if we're smart and quiet." She nodded, her young face serious, understanding the gravity in his tone. He needed confirmation, and he needed someone he could trust. His mind immediately went to Granny May, the old midwife who knew the town's hidden histories. She had been the one to tell him the well wasn't just dry. Billy Ray carefully wrapped the precious stone in a piece of old burlap and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the shack. A new kind of energy, a potent mixture of soaring hope and heart-pounding fear, pulsed through his veins. The impending visit from the social worker no longer felt like a looming execution. It felt like a deadline for a plan he was just beginning to form. He had a weapon now, a secret forged deep in the earth, and he had to learn how to wield it before his enemies found out it existed. That night, as Rosie and Willie slept soundly, calmed by the undeniable shift in his spirit, Billy Ray sat awake, a silent guardian. He was no longer just a boy fighting starvation. He was the keeper of a treasure, a strategist plotting the reclamation of his family's future, a future that suddenly seemed as real and tangible as the heavy, dark stone hidden beneath his feet. The news of Billy Ray's discovery spread through Thornton Creek like a wildfire. It took less than a week for Mr. Thornton to arrive, his luxury truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it screeched to a halt. He stormed onto the property, his face a mask of purple rage, the foreman trailing nervously behind him. "You little thief!" Thornton roared, his voice echoing across the now cleared land. "You think you can steal from me? That land is mine. There was a mistake in the paperwork." Billy Ray didn't flinch. He stood calmly in the doorway of his patched-up shack, a small, unmovable rock against a raging tide. Beside him, Granny May watched with her sharp, knowing eyes, her presence a silent shield. Rosie and Willie peeked out from behind their brother, no longer trembling with fear, but watching with a new defiant strength they had learned from him. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. This was Billy Ray's land now. Mr. Thornton continued his tirade, his voice escalating with every word. He threatened lawyers, he threatened the sheriff, and he once again threatened to call Child Protective Services, spitting the words like venom. "I'll have these kids taken from you so fast your head will spin. You'll rot in reform school for fraud." Billy Ray let him finish, the silence that followed hanging heavy in the air. Then, in a steady, quiet voice that cut through the bluster, he spoke. "You gave me this land, Mr. Thornton. You said, 'Take this dry well that's been dead for 40 years and get out.'" He then held up the deed, the very paper the boss had thrown at him in contempt. "Your signature is right here. Granny May is my witness. The whole town heard your promise at my father's funeral." Thornton stared at the paper, his face slackening in disbelief. He had been so certain of the boy's failure that he had sealed his own fate with his arrogance. 10 years later, the land was unrecognizable. The dilapidated shack was gone, replaced by a sturdy, welcoming home with a wide front porch. A successful, ethically run mining operation, Miller Family Mineral, now stood where Mr. Thornton's neglected mines had once been, employing dozens of local people with fair wages and safe conditions. Billy Ray, now 22, was a respected leader in the community, known for his integrity and quiet strength. Rosie, at 18, was preparing for college, her eyes bright with a future that had once seemed impossible. And Willie, a happy and boisterous 13-year-old, knew nothing of the gnawing hunger that had defined his early childhood. Inside their home, a framed photograph of Thomas and Grace Miller held a place of honor on the mantel, their gentle smiles overseeing the beautiful life their son had built from the ashes of their tragedy. Mr. Thornton's own life had taken a drastically different path. His empire, built on greed and neglect, had crumbled under the weight of his own hubris. Lawsuits from other families, emboldened by Billy Ray's success, drained his finances. His mines, poorly maintained, became unproductive, and he was forced to sell them off piece by piece for a fraction of their worth. One crisp autumn afternoon, a stooped, gaunt figure shuffled up the long driveway to the Miller home. It was Mr. Thornton, his expensive clothes replaced by worn, thin garments. He stood before Billy Ray, the boy he had once called a runt, his eyes downcast, and in a voice stripped of all its former arrogance, he asked for a job. He needed work, any work, just to be able to eat. The great mine owner was now a beggar. Billy Ray looked at the broken man before him, and for a moment he felt the searing memory of every insult, every threat, every hungry night his siblings had endured because of this man's cruelty. He saw Rosie and Willie watching from the porch, their expressions unreadable. He had the power to crush Mr. Thornton, to send him away with the same contempt he had been shown. He could have his revenge, but then he remembered his father's words about dignity, about the kind of man you choose to be. He looked at Thornton and said, "There's a position opening in the supply warehouse. It's hard work, but the pay is fair. You start Monday." Thornton looked up, stunned. "Why? After everything I did to you?" Billy Ray's answer was simple. "Because my father taught me to build things, not to break them. That's a lesson you never learned." In the quiet twilight, Billy Ray, Rosie, and Willie stood before two well-tended graves on a peaceful hillside overlooking their home. The simple stone markers read Thomas Miller and Grace Miller. Billy Ray knelt and gently cleared a stray leaf from his father's stone. "We did it, Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion but steady with pride. "I kept my promise. They're safe, they're happy, we're all still together." Rosie placed a bouquet of wildflowers between the graves, her hand resting on her mother's name. Willie stood beside them, no longer a small, frightened child, but a young man who understood the legacy of the family he belonged to. The three of them stood there for a long time, a united, unbreakable chain of siblings, their silhouettes framed against the setting sun, a testament to a love that had conquered all odds and a future that was finally, truly their own. Thank you for joining us for Billy Ray's powerful journey. If you believe in justice, in the unbreakable strength of family, and in the hope of a second chance, we invite you to become part of our community. Please subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who might be facing their own struggles and needs a reminder that perseverance can lead to miracles. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important messages to the world. We are a community that believes in the power of stories to inspire and heal, especially for young people navigating difficult times. Join us next time for another tale of incredible resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle.